Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 10 episodes of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is a revamp of a video I did 7 years ago where I count down my top 10 favorite episodes as well as my 5 least favorite episodes of Star Trek The Original Series. I thought it was about time for an update to this video, not only because that video was of poor quality as it was before I started making YouTube videos on a regular basis, but also I've changed my mind a bit on which episodes would make my top 10. Although I do look fondly on that original video as it was what got my entire channel started in the first place, as it received a lot more attention than I was expecting. I will, however, be deleting it as this video will be the update and replacement for that video. So this is now my official word on what my top 10 favorite episodes of Star Trek The Original Series are. So let's jump right into it, and as always, let me start by naming my bottom 5 worst episodes of Star Trek The Original Series, the episodes I personally like the least. So let's start with my number 5, The Apple. I always found The Apple to be the ultimate red shirt episode, as Kirk, Spock, Bones, and Chekhov beam down to a planet with a whole bunch of red shirts who gradually die off in the most ridiculous ways, including being hit in the shoulder by a club. I was never a fan of the red shirt cliche in the first place, and this episode was where it was at its worst. And it's just another cliche of this really powerful computer running a planet story, which the original series has done a dozen times, except this time it was just lazier, relying on a bunch of attractive Californian surfer type aliens. And then Kirk kills off their only source of food, shelter, and education, to which they're completely dependent on, and leaves them to fend for themselves with the they'll be alright attitude. So not a good episode. Moving on to number 4, the Sevege Curtain. This is the episode where the Enterprise runs across Abraham Lincoln floating in space. I don't think I actually need to say anything more than that, as that's just ridiculous and horrible on its own. But then, this show goes on to show an alien force. They force Kirk and Spock to fight to the death with some historical figures against other more notorious historical figures like Genghis Khan. This was a paper-thin plot just invented to have an excuse to show Abraham Lincoln team up with Kirk to fight Genghis Khan in hand-to-hand combat. And it's absolutely ridiculous, and the scenes of this episode are laughably bad. It almost plays out as a so bad it's good episode. Almost. Next is my number 3, Cat's Paw. This is a ridiculous Halloween-themed episode where an alien transforms into a black cat and uses scary images like skeletons to create Halloween-type labyrinth that Kirk and Spock get caught in. In fact, they even have ghosts going, "Ooh, Captain Kirk!" I mean, come on! It's not at all scary. It's just the most cheesy and ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Even when you view this episode through the lens of the time period in which it created, it still is ridiculous and cheesy. There are episodes of the original series that if you do give it, look through it through the lens of the time it came out, it still is relevant in present times. But this is most certainly not one of them. Number 2 on my list, on my worst list, is The Way to Eden. This episode is generally hated and looked down upon because it features a bunch of space hippies that come aboard the Enterprise and sing a bunch of hip songs. Let's be friends, brother. And while I agree this premise alone is enough to make this episode horrible, but my hatred of this episode goes beyond that, as if you examine it, the whole storyline is putting down the hippie movement of the 60s and any civil dissent, which is now looked upon as historically important, whereas the creators of this episode were obviously very strongly against it, as the blatant obvious message of this episode is, while naive, youngsters should just stay at home and toe the line and not interfere in matters that they don't understand. And that is a message to which history has taught us is total horseshit. Episodes like these were the result of Gene Roddenberry no longer being involved in the show, as in season 3 he left the show, and messages like these were directly opposed to what Star Trek is supposed to be all about. However, this isn't the only example of this, which leads me to my number 1 worst episode of Star Trek the Original Series, which is Turnabout Intruder. And again, this is another episode that is universally hated for the over-the-top hammy performance of William Shatner and this paper-thin plot. But in my opinion, most people overlook the real reason why this is the worst episode of Star Trek, and that is the message behind this episode is a very chauvinistic and sexist one. Again, this is the result of Roddenberry not being involved in the show and was a very obvious statement against the women's right movement of the 1960s, as the message of this episode is plain and clear, and that is women are not as capable as men and simply aren't capable of doing rational jobs like being a starship captain, as the whole plot shows a woman who was held back from advancing in Starfleet because of her gender and is bitter because of it, and this is the villain of the episode, mind you, and she switches bodies with Kirk to show that she is capable of commanding a starship, but then the episode shows that she isn't, even when in a man's body, because women are naturally emotional and irrational creatures. And after she goes insane, Kirk and Spock shake their heads with pity about why this woman couldn't just accept her place in society and stay in the kitchen. You know, as much as Star Trek is revered for making bold statements about race and gender equality in the 60s, this episode is directly antithetical to that purpose and tries to undo the good Trek has accomplished with a message that is not only antiquated, but disgusting. This, along with the aforementioned terrible, cheesy overacting by Shatner, makes this by far the worst episode of Star Trek the Original Series. So enough of the negativity. Let me now get into the best episodes of Star Trek the Original Series, but before I get to my top 10, let me start by naming some honorable mentions that didn't quite make my top 10. First honorable mention is The Ultimate Computer, an exciting episode where the Enterprise is taken over by a computer that goes insane and starts attacking other Starfleet vessels. This was a super intense and suspenseful episode featuring some great character moments when Kirk has to deal with this brilliant scientist who has now lost his mind. Next honorable mention is The Squire of Gothos, a fun episode where Kirk and crew encountered an all-powerful being that threatens their lives and toys with them, to only learn that the seemingly omniscient being is a child. And this revelation was played out so well and is a signature way that only the original series could do. And my final honorable mention is The Alternative Factor. And yes, I am aware this is generally looked upon as one of the worst episodes of the original series, and I contend it's actually one of the best. I go into more detail on this in my full-length review of this episode, but suffice to say here, I personally found it a complex, mind-bending mystery episode with a powerful resolution. This is one of the more cerebral episodes of the original series, and I love it regardless of what anyone else says about it. So now let me get into my top 10 favorite episodes of Star Trek the Original Series, starting with my number 10, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. This episode has been noted as many as one of the less subtle message-orientated episodes about race relations in the 1960s, as it portrays a species of aliens in a long, drawn-out war where these aliens are black on one side of their face and white on the other, and a race war is broken out against those who are black on the right side against those who are black on the left side. And although the message may be very obvious, it also is very effective, as it very accurately portrays how ridiculous prejudice and racial hate is, by allowing us to see it from an outsider's perspective and portraying a version that it's obviously ridiculous. And that's the power of the original series, that it's able to give its viewers a fresh view on current events and hot button topics by allowing them to view it from an outsider's perspective by using the tool of science fiction to make effective analogies. And this episode is a prime example of that, with a very powerful ending as well, making it extremely noteworthy. Number 9 on my list is All Our Yesterdays. This is a unique time travel episode that doesn't get nearly as much attention as I believe it deserves, as it's about a planet that is about to be destroyed by a supernova, where the planet's inhabitants have found a very unique way of surviving, and that is by time traveling into that planet's past. And of course, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy end up getting trapped in that past. What I love about this episode is, in addition to this unique idea, it has very strong character stories with where Spock falls in love with a woman who is trapped in that time period, and he's forced to leave her behind because of his duty to the ship, and this conflict that broke out between him and McCoy over whether they should stay or go, played out extremely well, making this a great episode. Coming in at number 8 is Errend of Mercy. This episode is most well known for being the first appearance of the Klingons, and I think this episode made them so interesting that it made sense that the Klingons became a reoccurring adversary. In this episode, the Klingons were actually kind of similar to the Klingons we knew and love today, whereas in the second season of the original series, they came off as more slimy cheeseball, almost Ferengi-like. But in this episode, they did introduce them as having a warrior-type culture, although it wasn't as based in honor as the Next Generation era Klingons were, but they evolved from there. And something many people forget is an actual war broke out between the Federation and the Klingon Empire in this episode, so the Klingons were introduced by thrusting them into a war. But of course, after this episode, it became a Cold War, making it the perfect analogy for the USSR. But I always loved the storyline with Kirk trying to fight the Klingons off as an extremely strategically important planet, but the local inhabitants were pacifists that refused to fight and would even turn against Kirk in order to avoid violence. So throughout this episode, they appeared to be naive and too primitive to understand what was really going on, but it turns out they were actually well-advanced energy beings that were actually much more knowledgeable and powerful than the Federation, and they forced this peace between the Federation and the Klingons. And I absolutely love the message of this episode, that peace at all costs should be the goal of any advanced civilized society, and I think this episode just did a brilliant job of making that message hit home in a very powerful way. Next is my number 7, Whom Gods Destroy. This is a fun episode and a highly underrated one, as I got a lot of comments on my last video saying that this episode doesn't deserve to be in the top 10, but I completely disagree. In fact, I would hold this episode as the best Kirk versus an adversary episode of the original series, and in my humble opinion, it's much better than the much revered Space Seed, which honestly I think only gets as much attention as it does because of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Whom Gods Destroy is an underlooked episode, and Captain Garth, or Lord Garth as he calls himself, was in my opinion the best villain to appear in the original series, and I hope to death that the rumors are true that we'll get his backstory in the upcoming Star Trek Discovery, but I have my doubts about that. Regardless, I was always fond of this character, and I found that it was a very suspenseful episode that has a lot of great lines, like, "I am not an insect," and "remove this animal," and other stuff I love saying, because Garth was such a great character, and all the alien cameos we saw in this episode, like the Andorians, Orions, Tellarites, and the dynamic that Kirk was trapped in an insane asylum and held captive by the inmates, was just such a great story, and I personally always loved it. Coming in at number 6 is The Changeling. This probably could be considered a bottle episode, as most of it takes place inside the ship and features a lot of dialogue scenes, mostly with Kirk and crew talking to a large floating tin can. But goddamn, is this episode ever suspenseful. And that's such an amazing accomplishment, and something I always appreciate is when you can take a simple premise that relies mostly on dialogue rather than big action sequences or special effects and just make it suspenseful as hell. In my humble opinion, this is the most suspenseful episode of the entire original series, as there's this level of tension that is so thick throughout the entire episode where I was on the edge of my seat the whole time, because basically you have this planet killing machine similar to the Doomsday Machine, which is another great episode but didn't quite make my list. But instead of being this giant cone thingy in space, it's this tiny machine that is actually on board the Enterprise, and Kirk has got it fooled for the time being, but he knows that his hold on it is very thin and it could kill anyone or destroy the entire ship anytime that it wants to, and boy was that suspenseful. And I particularly loved the way this episode was resolved, even though it was, it relied on the whole computer self-destructing when it comes up with a logical error, which isn't actually a thing in reality, it's just a TV trope. However, it wasn't really established as a trope when the show first came out, so I'll give it a pass on that. Anyway, this episode did amazingly well, and simply loved when Kirk was quizzing Nomad about his origin, and then was just like, "Oh, you're wrong!" and tricked it into self-destructing. This was one of the best Kirk using his wits to save the day moments in the entire series. Next, we'll get to my number 5, which is the Menagerie. Now, I used to consider The Cage one of my all-time favorite episodes, as I actually liked seeing Captain Pike and the other crew, and I honestly thought it was a better pilot episode than Where No Man Has Gone Before, which was the one that was actually picked up by the networks. But after a while, I realized that this two-parter, The Menagerie, was an even better episode than The Cage, because it improved upon it in adding a whole nother layer to it by adding an extra storyline of Spock commandeering the Enterprise against orders in order to do a favor for his now paralyzed former captain, and was put on trial for insubordination. And also, this was an extremely creative way to use the footage that they had from the original pilot and incorporate it into the present storyline. And the twist on the ending where Pike gets to live a normal life with the illusion that he was whole again was a really nice touch, overall making this one of the show's most memorable episodes. Number 4 on my list is Mirror, Mirror, a classic original series episode, and for good reason, as it often and very rightfully is looked upon as the gold standard in parallel universe storytelling. Many of the aspects of this episode have become modern day tropes, such as giving a goatee to one's evil counterpart, and these are all intended as homages rather than mockery, and so that only speaks to the effect this single episode has had on pop culture overall. And talk about an episode that was tense and suspenseful throughout. Having Kirk and his away team be trapped in this nightmarish, brutal version of the Enterprise was indeed a very unique and special story. And it was also rare in the original series to see all 7 of the main cast members in the same episode, where all the supporting characters get a lot more attention, such as Horror having to play the part of seductress to further their goal of escape. And we get the evil version of Sulu, who wants to stand in their way, as well as Chekhov, who tries to kill Captain Kirk. There are few episodes that use the ensemble crew effectively, and thus this alone makes this episode stand out. But of course, the resolution of Kirk knowing Spock so well, he's even able to convince the evil Spock the error of his ways, was a very powerful one. This episode is a classic for a good reason. Next, we'll get to my number 3, Balance of Terror. This was a classic submarine type hunt episode that was executed perfectly. First and foremost, the reason this episode stands out is that the adversary in this episode is not a stereotypical mustache-twirling villain, but he is presented as a well-rounded, three-dimensional character. And it's amazing how we get a few scenes with him on his ship relying on the advice of his Centaurian, much in the same way Kirk relies on McCoy's Council. And this it portrays them as not much different than Kirk and crew, and although they do have a different culture, which is part of what leads them to sneak attack innocent outposts, which is something Starfleet would never do, but still, you get their perspective on it. It was also a very powerful move that made great social commentary, as Trek tends to do, by having the enemies in this episode, the Romulans, look similar to the Vulcans, which inspires some bigotry on the bridge against Spock, and the way Kirk deals with this is perfect. Also, Kirk confronting his own demons while hunting down this adversary was handled nicely, as was the impact of this episode that began with a marriage and ended with the groom dying in battle, and Kirk dealing with these consequences. They had this subtle scene of him simply walking down the corridors, which was absolutely powerful, making this a very unique and effective episode. Number 2 on my list is A Taste of Armageddon. Another underrated episode in my opinion, one that aged extremely well, as it's almost more relevant today than it was when it aired. This episode warns of the dangers of being too dependent on computers and making warfare too clean and easy, which may have the effect of desensitizing people to the horrors of war, which shouldn't be presented as clean and easy, as people need to see war for horror, as it should be avoided at all cost. In this episode, Kirk and crew encountered a planet that maintains a war with a neighboring planet fought entirely with computers. Has a simulated war, but whenever a hit is recorded in the simulation, those determined killed are required to report to disintegration chambers to die. And while this may seem like a civilized way to conduct war to the inhabitants, Kirk recognizes that it makes war all too clean and easy, and so he forces them to have a real, dirty, bloody war, so they realize that war is something to be avoided at all cost. And as I said, this is almost more relevant in current day society, with the use of drones, where someone halfway across the world can kill hundreds of people with the push of a button that more closely resembles video games than actual warfare. And the episode itself was very exciting and suspenseful, as it shows Kirk and his landing party escape captivity and start to wreak havoc on the planet, while Scotty tries to save the Enterprise from external attacks. This episode is not only powerful for its very poignant social commentary, but also its very exciting plot that really put Kirk's and crew to the test, making this an amazing episode overall. So finally, let me get to my number 1 favorite episode of Star Trek, the original series, and that is The City on the Edge of Forever. This is a classic and beloved episode of Star Trek, and for a very good reason, as it remains to this day a unique standard for all time travel stories, as it tells a very emotionally powerful story through the use of its strong character stories. Most likely having Kirk travel back in time to the 1930s to prevent McCoy in a drugged out state from altering history in a horrible way, only to find a unique woman whom has this sense of idealism that Kirk finds extremely refreshing, and he falls in love with her, only to find out that in order to restore the timeline, Kirk has to allow her to die by preventing McCoy from saving her life. And the way this was executed was incredibly heartbreaking, and even Shatner, who typically hams up with his acting, plays this very effectively in a beautiful and subtle way. Like when the line he gives, "Let's get the hell out of here." Not only that, but we get the introduction of the Guardian of Forever, a unique creature and fascinating invention of Star Trek, a sentient time portal capable of sending anyone back in time, something that really sparks the imagination. This episode wasn't just emotionally powerful, but exciting, as Kirk and crew face utter annihilation as the whole timeline was erased. And on top of that, it really sparks the imagination with a unique way to travel back into the past, while at the same time presenting rich characters with a strong character story. And all this and more make this my number 1 favorite episode of Star Trek, the original series. So that's it for my top 10 episodes of Star Trek The Original Series. I will also be doing update videos for my Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager episode top 10 videos in the coming weeks as well, so keep an eye out for that. However, I will not be doing one for Star Trek The Next Generation, as I have already done an update video for that episode top 10 a year ago, and I won't be doing one for Star Trek Enterprise as I don't feel it's necessary, as I'm happy with the top 10 I currently have. But be sure to keep an eye out on my channel as I continue to do more Star Trek videos, as well as covering many other shows such as Game of Thrones, Black Sails, The Expanse, The 100, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.